I wasn't in a good place that spring, and that's the plainest way I can say it without trying to dress it up. I was 42, good with a torque wrench, bad with silence, and fresh off signing separation papers in a county office that smelled like copier toner and old coffee. By the time I turned my truck south toward my grandmother's place in the Ozarks, I'd spent most of winter working late, drinking later, and waking up with the same hard thought in my chest. There wasn't much left in me worth keeping. I told folks I was heading out to handle an estate. Truth was, I was trying to hide in a place where nobody expected conversation. My grandmother Mavis had raised me from 11 on after my mama moved to Tulsa and my dad drifted in and out of counties like weather fronts. Mavis never made speeches, she handed me jobs. Water troughs low. Gate hinge is singing again. You break it, you fix it. That was love in her language, practical and steady, and it suited me fine. When she got sick, she never said how bad it was. Dale called me one Tuesday in November and said I ought to come quick. I got there Thursday night to a dark porch and casseroles cooling in other people's pans. I stood in her kitchen and holding the back of a chair like I might still have work to do. And it hit me too late, can feel heavier than grief, because there's nowhere to set it down. The house had sat mostly shut since the funeral, and when I opened it again in March, it gave off cedar, dust, mouse droppings, and the faint sweetness of her old hand soap still stuck in the bathroom towel. Her yellow radio sat on the counter, unplugged, with a grocery list under a magnet shaped like an apple. Flour, feed mineral, lamp oil, black pepper. The bed was made tight enough to bounce a quarter, the way she taught me when I was 12 and stubborn about corners. I walked room to room like an inspector, naming repairs out loud so I wouldn't have to name anything else. Fascia board rotten on the west side. 2 shingles gone over the mudroom. Backstep settling. I could handle that list. I preferred lists that stayed still. The land wasn't staying still. Anybody from round here knows what March can do when winter lets go all at once. We called it the breakup, and it sounded mild until you watched it happen. Frost came out of the ground in chunks, creek ice rotted from beneath, and every low place turned to a grey-brown paste that could swallow a boot to the ankle and keep it. Culverts choked with branches and old leaves. Pasture grass drowned before it even had a chance to green. Mavis had kept a small herd, not many heads, just enough to keep the place working and to put a little money aside every fall. I'd promised myself I'd patch roof, sort papers, rehome the cattle and list the acreage by May. Quick and clean. A mechanic's plan. Get in, tighten bolts, get out. By the second week of March, that plan looked neat only on paper. Every morning I pulled on rubber boots and did the same circuit. Feed in the upper lot, check the south fence where the wire dipped near the old cottonwood, walk the creek bank with a shovel and pry bar, clear what I could from the culvert mouth, then come back muddy and sore before noon. Juniper, Mavis's old cattle dog, followed me in a lopsided trot, one ear up and one folded from some long-ago scrape with barbed wire. She was 12 if she was a day, grey in the muzzle, still serious about her work. She watched stock, watched me, watched the tree line like she was keeping 2 jobs going at once. At night, she slept by the wood stove and kicked in her dreams. I had been a diesel mechanic for 20 years, and that work taught me a kind of faith that doesn't get called faith. You trust what you can test. You listen for the miss in an idle. You look for wet lines where a seal is failing. You don't need stories when you have gauges. My grandmother had stories anyway, little local sayings attached to weather and ridges and creek bends, and I used to roll my eyes through half of them while still doing exactly what she said. She'd point at a cloud bank and tell me to bring the hay in now, and the storm would hit by supper. She'd smell the wind and say, "Don't leave that chainsaw in the shed tonight. Water's coming." She was right, so often it felt rude to call it luck. I parked my duffel in the room I used as a kid, the one with the paint-chipped dresser and a base tournament poster from 1998, still thumbtacked crooked to the wall. First night there, I sat on the edge of that bed with a legal pad and made columns. Repairs, sale prep, cattle contacts, probate notes. I wrote my wife's name once in the margin and crossed it out hard enough to tear the paper. We hadn't fought loud, not really. We had worn down slow like a belt pulley losing grip. She said I went quiet for whole seasons, that I could spend an hour diagnosing a fuel system but couldn't answer a simple question about what I felt. She wasn't wrong. Signing those papers didn't feel like an explosion. It felt like a machine shutting off, one click at a time until all you heard was the cooling tick of metal. On the third morning, sleet came in sideways and rattled the kitchen windows. I stood at the sink with instant coffee and watched the pasture blur under a white grit that wasn't quite snow and wasn't quite rain. Juniper stood at the door and whined once, low and annoyed, as if weather itself had broken a promise. I pulled my coat on and went anyway, because stock doesn't care about your mood. The heifers were huddled tight at the upper feeder, steam rising off their backs. The lower lot had gone to soup. A cedar limb snapped somewhere uphill with that dry rifle crack sound, and then the creek answered with a bigger voice, heavy and fast. I told myself this was weather, not warning. I said it twice, like saying it made it truer. Around noon, I called Dale from the truck so I could run the heater while I talked. Dale Henson had the neighbouring spread east of ours, and the kind of calm you only get from 50 years of fences, hay, and busted machinery. He picked up on the second ring. "You holding up over there?" he asked. "Define holding up," I said. "I got one culvert breathing and one trying to die. South line's a bog. You hearing anything on crest timing?" "County says overnight push. Could be nothing, could be a mess. You clear that willow jam by your bend yet?" "Got half of it. Other half's married to the bank." He gave a short grunt that might have been a laugh. "Your grandma used to beat storms with a garden rake and pure stubborn. You got both of those?" "Got stubborn. Rake's in the barn." "Then keep your boots dry if you can. And Roy?" "Yeah? You don't have to do all this alone just because you're hard-headed." "I'm not alone. I got a dog supervising." "That dog's smarter than both of us," he said, and we hung up. That was the shape of most days then. Work until dark, eat something from a can, stare at papers I didn't want, sleep in slices. I found envelopes in Mavis's desk with seed receipts clipped in order by month. I found a coffee tin labelled Twine with exactly $6.38 under it, folded neat. I found my own handwriting in an old Bible, age 13, where I'd practiced my name big and crooked on the flyleaf, like I was marking property. In the mudroom, I found her raincoat still hanging, blue and faded, pockets full of bailing gloves and one peppermint melted in a wrapper. Grief is a strange mechanic. It can leave you numb in a cemetery and then crack you open over a candy that went soft in somebody's pocket. Some evenings I sat on the back steps and watched the ridge darken in layers. Oak first, then cedar, then the black line where sky and timber stopped agreeing. The frogs hadn't started yet. Crows still worked the fields, loud as always, and geese moved high overhead in ragged V's that looked hand-drawn. Wind came in damp from the creek and carried mud, wet bark, and that mineral smell of turned ground. The place should have felt like home. Instead, it felt like a measuring stick I kept failing against. Mavis made this land hold together through drought, freeze, and one summer when the barn roof peeled like a sardine can in straight-line wind. I was here 6 days, and already losing patience with gates and paperwork and my own thoughts. When sleep did come, it came hard and short. I woke before dawn one morning to the sound of rain on metal so steady it might have been static. For 10 seconds I forgot where I was. And then I remembered all at once. The separation papers folded in my duffel, Mavis gone, roof leaking over the pantry corner, floodwater climbing in the bottoms. Juniper lifted her head from the hearth and thumped her tail once, like she was clocking in for shift change. I brewed coffee strong enough to make my hands twitch and stepped onto the porch. The pasture below was all standing water and drowned fence posts, silver in the first light. I could hear the creak from there, a long, rolling rush that made the boards under my boots feel thinner than they were. I leaned on the porch rail and looked toward the cedar break where the property line ran crooked, and for a minute I just breathed and listened. I wasn't praying. I didn't know what I was doing exactly. Taking inventory, maybe, of weather, of damage, of what a man had left after he'd disappointed people he loved, and missed a goodbye he could never get back. The list was not encouraging. Still, the day was waiting, and days do not care how you feel about them. I set my mug down, whistled for Juniper, and headed for the barn with a shovel over one shoulder and the old pry bar in my left hand, telling myself if I could keep the water moving and the cattle fed, that would be enough for now. For that morning, it had to be. The barn door fought me like it had swollen overnight. Wood rubbed raw against wood, and when it finally gave, I stepped into that wet hay smell and diesel tang that had followed every spring of my life. Juniper squeezed past my leg, shook rain in a fine spray, then stood by the aisle with her head low and eyes on me, waiting for orders she already knew. I checked the feed bins, counted bales, ran my hand along the old cedar chest freezer where Mavis kept mineral blocks stacked like bricks. My hands moved on habit while my mind dragged. I kept looking at things and seeing two versions at once, what they were and what they had been when she was here. And that second view took the strength out of my knees more than hauling sacks ever did. The lower gate chain had frozen in a knot of rust and ice, and I spent 10 minutes with the pry bar and a hammer before it loosened enough to swing. Water stood in the wheel ruts like dull mirrors. The heifers crowded the high side of the lot, sides heaving, ears flicking at sleet that had turned to cold rain. I pitched feed, checked hooves as best I could without stressing them, then walked fence line with my shoulders hunched, the reins slipping down my collar no matter what I did. There is a kind of loneliness that comes from silence, and there's another kind that comes from hearing only your own labour. Shovel bite, boot suck, wire ping, breath. That morning I got the second kind in full. At the creek bend, the willow jam I'd been fighting had grown a new tangle overnight. Limbs, old corn stalks, trash from somewhere upstream, all packed tight against the culvert mouth with the force of a fist. I jammed the shovel in and pulled until my forearms burned. Mud slid from under me and I went down to one knee, then both. Water soaking through the denim so fast it felt like I'd knelt in a bucket. I stayed there a moment longer than I needed to, head hanging, rain tapping the brim of my cap. The creek rushed loud enough to swallow a curse, so I gave it one anyway. I stood, set my boots, and kept at it. That's all there was to do. Piece by piece the jam loosened, then lurched free with a sucking groan and shot downstream, spinning. Water took a deeper draw through the pipe, not fixed, but better. I braced both hands on the shovel handle and watched that current run brown and angry around sycamore roots. I could hear Mavis in memory, not mystical, just memory clear as if she were at my shoulder. Don't fight the whole creek, Roy. Give it somewhere to go. She said it about floodwater and about grief, though I hadn't understood the second part when I was young enough to think pain could be outworked. By late morning, the rain settled into a steady, thin sheet, less violent, more relentless. I made another circuit because routine was the only thing keeping me from wandering in circles inside my own head. Porch to barn, barn to south fence to creek, creek back to porch. Juniper trotted ahead, stopped at corners, checked on me with that one upright ear, then moved again. I talked to her more than I'd talked to any person in weeks. "You and me, old girl," I said while I tightened a sagging strand of wire. "High ambition, keep water out and bad thoughts out." She sneezed mud off her nose and gave me a look that said she was managing one of those better than I was. There was a point, near noon, when I climbed the knoll behind the smokehouse to look over the whole lower pasture and had to sit down on a wet stump because my chest went tight with plain discouragement. Water had climbed another 6 inches since dawn. Fence posts looked shorter. The tractor path was gone beneath a moving sheen. If the crest came hard overnight, I'd be running stock in the dark and guessing where firm ground started. I rubbed both hands over my face and stared at the cedar break, where the timber rose dark and dense beyond the last field edge. I had come here to repair shingles and sign papers and leave. Instead, I was soaked, bone-tired and talking to a dead woman in my head because she was still the person who made me feel less wrong. I remember thinking, clear as a wrench laid on a bench, that maybe I was not built for starting over. Not after the separation, not after missing Mavis at the end, not at an age where people expect you to have learned your own wiring. I could diagnose a seized turbo by sound, yet I could not figure out why every room and every fence post seemed to ask me whether I was staying or running. I wanted certainty, a number on a gauge, green or red. Instead, I got weather, memory, and mud. I told myself to stand up and finish the day because there wasn't any audience for collapse out here, and Juniper was already on her feet waiting. When I came down off that knoll, I took the long path past the lean-to because I needed more kindling in the house. I had tossed what was left of the dry stack 3 nights ago and hadn't had a stretch of weather fit for splitting since. I expected soggy scraps and bark peeling off in wet curls. What I found stopped me so completely that I nearly walked into a post. Under the lean-to roof, tucked back from the drip line where the wind couldn't reach, sat a perfect half-cord of dry oak in a storm-proof crisscross stack. Not tossed, not hurried, not the way I stack when my back hurts and daylight's fading. This was tight and clean, rows alternating direction, bark out, split faces in, top course locked so rain would shed. There wasn't a wet stick in it. The cuts were mixed lengths from old rounds I hadn't touched yet, and the whole thing sat square on 2 pallet runners I'd left there years ago and forgotten. I stood there with rain dripping off my cap brim, trying to run through explanations that matched the facts. Dale didn't come over unasked, and if he had, he'd have left boot tracks all across that churned mud. No tracks, no tire marks either. Just my own ruts from yesterday, half washed down. I set the shovel against the wall and crouched to check the bottom row, because skepticism is a habit that survives bad weather and bad months. Dry, truly dry. Whoever had stacked it knew what they were doing and knew the storm was coming. Then I turned toward the old stump beside the path, the one where Mavis used to scatter cracked corn for cardinals and jays. And there on top sat 2 smooth river stones, crossed in an even X. One grey, one rust brown. Both clean despite the mud spatter everywhere else, scented like they had been placed with care and then left, alone on purpose. I wish I could tell you I reacted like a sensible grown man. I did not. I actually muttered thank you to a woodpile while holding a muddy wrench, like it might print me a receipt, then glanced around to make sure no one had witnessed my decline into polite conversation with stacked oak. The laugh that came out of me was short and rough, but it was a laugh. First one in a while, it faded when I noticed Juniper. She had come up beside me without a sound and sat down. Not stiff, not bristled, no warning growl in her chest. Just calm. Tail thumping slow against the wet ground. Her eyes fixed past the lean-to toward the cedar line. I followed her gaze. The tree line stood still in the rain, trunks dark, understory veiled with mist and brush. Nothing moved that I could see. No deer stepping through, no neighbor in a slicker, no shape shifting between trunks. But the crows that had been arguing all morning were quiet. So were the jays. Even the usual drip and rattle off the tin roof seemed to settle into a softer rhythm, like the place had taken one long breath and held it. "Junie," I said, low, not wanting to break whatever this was. "You see somebody?" She thumped her tail again, once, twice, and kept looking. Not at me, not nervous, expectant almost. I had seen that look when she waited for a calf to find its feet, patient and intent. A smell drifted through then under wet cedar and churned mud. Forest musk, earthy and animal. Not foul, just present, as if something large had passed through damp leaves recently and left warmth in the air. My neck prickled out of reflex, old mammal wiring. But fear never took hold. I waited for it, and it never came. What came instead was a strange, steady awareness that I was not by myself, and whoever had been there had gone out of their way to help before being seen. I walked to the edge of the lean-to and scanned the yard again, slow this time, reading details the way I read an engine bay. Porch rail, gate latch, boot prints, rake by the wall, feed sack by the step. No damage, no signs of somebody testing boundaries. Just that woodpile, those crossed stones, and a dog who looked toward the timber with the relaxed trust she never gave strangers. The rain eased to mist. A single drop ran off the brim of my cap and landed on one of the stones, beaded there, then slid down the edge. I reached out, touched the top stone with 2 fingers, and it was cool and slick and ordinary. That ordinary feel almost undid me more than anything else. No fireworks, no grand reveal. Just a small arrangement on a stump and dry firewood where there should have been none. By the first week of real thaw, Mavis always said, the woods told you what kind of spring you were going to have if you paid attention. I had spent years pretending I didn't hear that kind of talk, then half my life discovering she was usually right in ways that didn't need arguing. Standing there with Juniper at my side, I looked toward the cedars and felt the weight in my chest shift 1 degree off-center. Not gone, just moved enough to notice. I picked up 2 armloads of oak and carried them to the porch, then went back for more, working slower than before, listening between each trip to the hush at the edge of the trees and the soft, steady thump of Juniper's tail. I made a 3rd trip to the lean-to and stopped halfway back to the porch, wood stacked in my arms because Juniper had changed her rhythm. Her tail quit thumping and she stood, not alarmed, just intent, ears tilted toward the cedar brake like she was listening for a familiar truck coming up a long drive. I set the wood down on the porch boards, wiped rain off my face with my sleeve, and walked back to the stump. The crossed stones were still there, neat as a mark on a map. I crouched and looked for tracks again, slower than I had before, reading mud the way Mavis taught me to read weather. I found my own boot prints, heel heavy on the right from an old knee tweak. I found Juniper's paw marks blurred where rain had softened edges. Past that, 10 feet out from the lean-to, I found a depression, broad as a dinner plate, pressed deep into the wet ground, not sharp enough to cast clean detail, just weight and shape. A second one farther off, angled toward the trees. It might have been slumped mud. It might have been where runoff dropped from the eave. I measured it against my spread hand anyway, and felt my chest tighten for reasons I couldn't name. "Okay," I said out loud because naming facts kept me steady. "Could be anything." Juniper looked at me, then back toward the timber. I carried the rest of the oak to the rack by the mudroom and went through the motions of the day, but curiosity had worked under my skin like a splinter. Every task came with one ear turned toward the cedars. I topped the trough in the upper lot, checked the hay netting, walked the weak section of south fence and tightened 2 clips, all while replaying that clean crisscross stack in my head. Nobody around here stacked like that unless they learned from somebody older than us. It had Mavis in it. Not her hands, but her kind of care. Around mid-afternoon, the rain thinned to a drift of mist, and a quiet settled over the place so complete it made the hair on my arms lift. No crows, no jay chatter, no squirrel bark from the walnut behind the smokehouse. Even the cows chewed in silence, heads low, ears twitching at flies that weren't there yet. I stood by the gate with my gloves in one hand and listened so hard my jaw ached. Then, from somewhere inside the cedar line, I heard 3 soft footfalls, spaced wide, deliberate, each one cushioned like whoever made them knew where every branch lay. Not charging, not crashing, just moving careful. I turned toward the sound and waited. Nothing else came. Juniper trotted up beside me, sat against my shin, and leaned her shoulder into my leg. Her breathing stayed easy. That told me more than my own nerves did. By the time the light started flattening toward evening, I made myself go inside and call Dale, partly for practical reasons and partly so I could hear another human voice and test my own. He picked up with his usual unhurried hello, and I stood at the kitchen window watching mist bead on the porch rail while I talked. "You near your radio?" I asked. "County still saying crest overnight?" "Still saying it, yeah. Why, you seeing a rise already?" "Not much rise, just odd day. Quiet as a church in January, and somebody stacked me half a cord under the lean-to while I was out working. Dry oak, good stack." A pause, then a low whistle. "I didn't come over, if that's what you're asking. My boys are with me at the East Crossing." "I know it wasn't you. I just wanted to hear myself say it out loud." Dale let that sit a second. "Your grandma used to tell me kind things don't announce themselves, Roy. Keep your eyes open and your gates high. I'll swing by tomorrow if roads hold." We hung up, and I set the phone down harder than I meant to. Kind things don't announce themselves. That line hit me square in the sternum. Mavis had said it about people who dropped casseroles without taking credit, about neighbours who fixed a fence while you were at a funeral, about small mercies that showed up without speeches. Standing there in her kitchen, with her magnet apple still holding that grocery list, I realized I had spent months convincing myself kindness had a short shelf life. Maybe that was easier than admitting I missed it. I stepped back outside with a coil of calf rope and the fencing pliers, meaning to check the lower lot before dusk. Halfway to the barn, I saw the rope I was carrying had an empty space where the old red lead line should have been. I stopped, frowned, and looked around. The missing line sat on the porch mat, coiled neat as a feed store display, burrs picked off, not untangled. I hadn't put it there. Juniper sniffed it once and wagged. I laughed under my breath, dry and disbelieving. "Now you're doing housekeeping." The humour lasted maybe 5 seconds, then gave way to a focused alertness I hadn't felt in months. Grief had been a weight pressing me flat. This was different. It asked me to notice. I walked the porch perimeter, checked corners, checked the rain barrel, checked the stump again. Crossed stones unchanged. No pry marks on doors, no disturbance around the fuel shed, no sign of anyone testing locks or taking stock. Whoever had been near the house moved like somebody who understood boundaries better than most people I knew. Toward late day, the sky darkened by degrees, cloud ceiling dropping low enough to snag the ridge tops. A fresh shower rolled in, fine and steady. I pulled my hood up, grabbed the lantern, and headed down to the lower pasture to move 2 heifers upslope before dark. The ground there had gone from mud to slurry, each step making that wet pull sound like a boot leaving clay. Juniper ranged ahead, circling wide around the pair and easing them toward the lane with patient pressure. She was old, but on stock she still carried herself like a foreman. At the lane break, I heard those careful footfalls again, this time off to my right, pacing parallel beyond the fence line. I stopped and listened. The steps stopped too. I took 3 more strides, and the unseen walker matched me. Same distance, same measured cadence. No brush crashing, no snapped limbs. Just weight placed exactly where it needed to go. "I know you're there," I said, and my own voice sounded small under the rain. Nothing answered, not with sound, but Juniper glanced toward the trees, tail moving slow, then returned to her work like she had no concerns to report. That steadied me enough to finish moving the heifers. I latched the upper gate, checked the hinge twice, and looked at the sky. Dusk was coming fast, turning the whole place blue-grey. Rain made a silver mesh in the lantern glow. I should have gone in. Any sensible man would have gone in, dried out, eaten beans from a can, and left mysteries for daylight. Instead, I kept the lantern low and walked toward the cedar break, where the pasture narrowed near the old rock pile, because curiosity had taken the wheel and grief had slid to the passenger seat for once. A newborn bawled from somewhere ahead, high and uncertain. I knew that sound. One of the red heifers had been close for days. I cut left through knee-high wet grass and found her in a shallow rise near the fence, sides trembling, calf half up and half down in the mud, long legs folding under him each time he tried to stand. She swung her head when she saw me, not aggressive, just strained and exhausted. I set the lantern on a flat stone and talked low, the same nonsense-sure tone I'd heard Mavis use on every frightened animal that ever hit this place. "You're all right, girl. Easy now. We'll get him sorted." Juniper sat 10 yards off, eyes moving between me and the cedar line, not guarding me from anything, more like making introductions. Then I saw him. He stood beyond the fence at the edge of the cedars, rain dark on his fur, so tall the top wire hit around mid-thigh by comparison. 8 feet at least, maybe more, but size was the second thing I noticed. The first was how still and open he held himself, shoulders lowered, hands visible at his sides, head slightly dipped as if to make himself less imposing. He took 1 step forward and placed his foot between briars without crushing them, then stopped when the heifer tensed. Waited. When she settled, he shifted again, slow as dusk itself. I went cold, then strangely calm. Every story I'd ever dismissed as campfire noise lined up in my head and failed to match what was in front of me. There was no challenge in him. No charge, no posturing, just attention, steady and deliberate, directed first at the calf, then at me, then back to the calf as if we were 3 workers on the same problem. I remember thinking, this cannot be real, and in the same breath, knowing reality was standing 20 yards away in the rain. I wanted to run because that is what a body does when the world exceeds its categories. I wanted to stay because leaving that calf in this mud wasn't an option, and because something in that gaze told me I was not in danger. My mind went through its usual routine. Prank suit, escaped animal, bad light, stress, grief, lack of sleep. None of those theories could account for the way he moved around the wire, lifting it with 2 fingers so it wouldn't sing, stepping through without snagging, then turning broadside to the heifer so she could see him clearly and choose not to panic. I had watched rough men mishandle livestock my whole life. This was gentler than most of them. The calf tried again, slipped, and splayed. Before I could cross the last few feet, the big figure lowered into a squat that should have looked awkward for that much mass, and somehow didn't. One hand, huge and dark against the pale mud, slid under the calf's chest with feather-light support, not lifting fully, just giving enough to help the little legs find purchase. The other hand stayed open, visible away from the heifer's head. He never crowded her, never rushed. Juniper rose and moved in a small arc, tail level, then sat again as if she had approved the method. Easy, I heard myself say, though I wasn't sure whether I meant the cow, the calf, or me. The calf found his feet, wobbling hard. The heifer blew out a long breath and began licking him with frantic relief. The figure stayed crouched one heartbeat longer, then eased back, palms out, and rose to full height. Up close, the scale should have broken my nerve. Instead, it gave me a second, stranger feeling. Humility, maybe, like I was standing in front of something older than my anger and kinder than my recent beliefs. Rain ticked on leaves. Lantern light shook in the wind and painted gold along the wet fence wire. He turned his head toward me and I saw his eyes clearly for the first time, amber brown and steady, no malice in them at all. A quiet regard, recognition without demand. I swallowed, took one careful step back to give space, and nodded before I could talk myself out of it. "Thank you," I said, plain and low. He held my gaze for a long second, then shifted his attention to Juniper. She thumped her tail once against the mud. That tiny sound landed in me like a verdict. Trusted. By full dusk, the rain had deepened again, and the mist between us thickened until edges softened. He moved first, not away in haste, just backward one measured step, then another, keeping his body angled so I could track him. At the cedar line he paused, one hand touching the trunk of a young tree as lightly as if greeting it, then disappeared into shadow without a branch snapping. I stood with mud to my ankles and rain running down my neck, lantern hissing by my boot, while the calf leaned into his mother and found milk. Juniper came to my side and pressed against my leg, warm and solid and real. My hands were shaking, not with fear, with the strain of having my old framework break and not knowing yet what shape would replace it. I clipped the lantern to the fence, looked toward the dark cedars where he had gone, and listened to the quiet like it was saying my name in a language I was only beginning to understand. I kept listening a little longer, standing in that wet lane with the lantern hiss, and the calf's thin nursing sounds mixing together, waiting for my pulse to settle into something useful. Juniper leaned against me until my shaking eased, then stepped out and circled the heifer and calf once, slow and businesslike, as if reminding me there was still work to finish. I took the lantern, unhooked the top strand of wire, and eased the pair toward the higher paddock. The heifer followed with that tired, stubborn push new mothers have, and the calf wobbled after her on legs that looked too long for his body. At the cedar edge where I had last seen him, the mud held a string of deep impressions leading back into shadow. I set the lantern down and crouched with rain running off my sleeves. Each print was broader than my chest, heel and forefoot clear enough to read, toes splayed just a touch for traction on the slope. The stride length stayed even, and the path bent around saplings instead of over them. Not one snapped stem, not one gouged trunk. I reached into my jacket for the tape measure I kept clipped in the chest pocket, drew it out, and measured heel to heel while Juniper watched me like she had seen me do strange things before. 53 inches on one step, 51 on the next. I measured again because disbelief is stubborn by design. I ran through every explanation I could stand behind. A prank suit would have sunk and slipped in this muck. Stilts would have punched deeper and left edge drag. A man trying to fake size would have overplayed it, crushed brush, broken wire, left some signature of hurry. This trackline had none of that. Whoever made it moved with intention and a kind of courtesy I had no category for. I put the tape away, wiped mud off my fingers, and stood there while rain darkened the knees of my jeans. I told myself this couldn't be real. I am overtired, soaked through running on coffee and grief. I am seeing pattern where there is none. I am making a story because stories are easier than empty rooms. I kept lining those sentences up in my head like bolts on a bench, and each one rolled off the table the moment I looked back at those tracks. The facts stayed put. A calf stood because a huge, careful hand had steadied him. A heifer had settled instead of panicked. Juniper had offered trust with her whole body. Whatever had met me out there had not been hiding from me. He had been giving me room. By the time full dark settled over the ridge, the creek had climbed enough that I could hear a new note in it from the yard, a heavier push under the usual rush. I got the mother and calf secured in the upper shed, checked latches twice, then headed for the house to grab dry gloves and the county flood map Mavis kept folded in a drawer. The map was old, corners soft from years of handling, her handwriting in pencil marking high water years with little circles and dates. 1997, 2008, 15. I laid it on the kitchen table, ran my finger down to our bend, and felt that tightness in my chest return. If the lower swale overtopped, the weakest side of the barn would take first hit. That was where I had stacked winter feed and where Mavis kept one cedar trunk of family papers and keepsakes she never trusted to banks. I called Dale anyway, mostly to confirm what my ears were telling me. He answered on the third ring with wind in the background. "You hearing that creek?" I asked. "Yeah," he said. "East crossing's already over the apron. You need a hand?" "Road won't hold your trailer at this hour." "Then move what matters and don't get stubborn with water." "I'm heading to the lower barn now." A short pause. "Roy, listen to me. Pick what you can carry fast. Leave pride for tomorrow." "I hear you. Call at first light, one way or the other." "I will." I hung up, shoved the phone in my pocket and said out loud to an empty kitchen, "What matters?" Then I grabbed 2 tarps, 6 empty feed tubs, my headlamp, and a box of contractor bags. Juniper was already at the door, keyed up but steady, and when I opened it, she moved with that old working trot straight toward the barn lane. The rain thickened from steady to hard in the space of 10 minutes, each drop sharp against the hood of my jacket. Water ran in silver threads down the packed track, pooling at low spots, carrying straw and bits of bark. Inside the lower barn, the smell hit me first. Wet hay, old wood, mineral salt, cold iron. I clipped the headlamp on and moved quick. 2 feed sacks to the hand truck. Mineral tubs stacked by the door. Calf starter bags onto a pallet I could drag upslope. Juniper stationed herself at the threshold and watched the yard, ears working. On my second pass, I heard a creak from the far side wall. Not the usual weather groan, but a sharp complaint where the sill met the post. I swung the lamp beam across and saw water pushing under the door on the low end, thin at first, then thickening to a muddy sheet. I swore, dropped the hand truck handles and headed for the back alcove where Mavis's cedar trunk sat under the shelf of canning jars. The trunk was waist high, old red cedar gone dark with age, corners wrapped in brass. Heavy dry. Heavier now with damp. I got both hands under one end and lifted just enough to feel the weight argue back. I could drag it maybe, but not fast through water, with the floor starting to float loose straw and old nails. I set it down and stood there, breathing hard, trying to decide what to abandon and what to save first. And that old late arrival guilt hit me so hard I had to brace a hand against the wall. Papers, photos, her recipe cards in a tobacco tin, my grandfather's army watch that no longer ran. A life in a box. I had failed her once already. I could not leave that trunk to floodwater. Juniper gave one low woof from the door, not alarm, more like a signal. I turned my headlamp toward the entrance and froze. He stood just outside the threshold in the rain, larger than the doorframe by a full head, shoulders beaded with water, hands open at his sides. He did not step in. He waited, eyes on me, then shifted his gaze to the trunk and back to me with a small tilt of his head that read as plain as speech. I nodded before I realized I was doing it. "Yeah," I said, voice rough. "That one." He ducked under the lintel with care that looked almost practiced, turning his shoulders so his fur barely brushed the hanging harnesses. The barn seemed to shrink around him, not from threat, but from scale. He crossed to the alcove in 3 silent steps and knelt beside the trunk. The one hand slid under, the other steadied the lid so it wouldn't jar open, and he lifted it clean as if it were a toolbox. No strain, no rush, just control. He turned and carried it out into the rain, keeping it level while I grabbed the tarps and stumbled after him. He did not head upslope blind. He took the higher edge of the lane where gravel still held, stepping around washouts I would have walked straight into under that rain. At the porch, he set the trunk down under the eave, far from splashback, then pulled the loose tarp corner over it with 2 precise motions of those huge hands. Juniper trotted up, sniffed the trunk, then looked up at him and thumped her tail against the porch post. I stood there panting, rainwater streaming off my jacket, and gave a short, disbelieving laugh that sounded half like a sob. "You haul keepsakes better than my cousins," I said, because my mouth needed something ordinary to do. "Don't tell them I said that." He watched me for a beat, then turned his head toward the barn and the lower lot, where the cattle had started to bawl in anxious bursts. Work remained. He moved first, not commanding, just going, and I followed with the lantern bouncing at my side. The next hour ran like a practiced drill we had never rehearsed. I dragged feed sacks to the lane. He carried them one-handed to high ground and stacked them under the upper shed overhang in neat rows, plastic sides outward so labels stayed visible in low light. I wrestled sandbags from behind the smokehouse. He set them shoulder to shoulder where runoff was cutting a channel toward the barn posts. When the weak gate at the upper lot started to cant inward under pressure from nervous heifers, he braced the post with his shoulder while I drove a T-post beside it and wired the 2 together with numb fingers. He held still until I cinched the final wrap, then stepped back and checked the line like a foreman inspecting welds. By midnight, the rain eased just enough to trade roar for constant drumming. The creek was out of its banks in the bottoms, a wide, dark sheet moving through grass and fence. Lantern light and my headlamp made narrow islands in it. Juniper worked the calves uphill in short arcs, flanking and releasing, and he mirrored her pattern from farther out, circling wide so the stock had room to choose the safer path. His size should have scattered them. Instead, the calves followed Juniper's lead and drifted away from water, glancing at him once and then settling as if some older farm logic had clicked into place. At one point, a yearling balked near the washout, front hooves skidding on slick clay. I took 2 steps forward with my arms out, talking low, and he moved to the opposite side and lowered himself enough to narrow his shape. Not crowding, not cutting off, just making a broad, quiet wall that turned the animal back toward firm ground. The yearling snorted, turned, and went where we needed him to go. We held there another second until the lane cleared, then resumed without fuss. Somewhere in that muddy hour, with my shoulders burning and my gloves gone heavy as sponges, I felt the last hard plank of skepticism in me give way. Not break dramatic, just soften and sink. Wonder came in its place, not bright and loud, more like warmth reaching numb hands. I still tracked facts. I still counted sacks and checked latches and read water flow by flashlight. But alongside all of that ran a second certainty. The world had made room for a kindness larger than my understanding. And tonight, that kindness had shown up at my barn door and taken instructions from a mechanic who didn't deserve that kind of grace. Near 2 in the morning, the main rush shifted. The creek still ran high, but the water at the barn threshold stopped rising. I noticed because the floating straw line held steady against a nail head I'd been using as a marker. 10 minutes later, it had dropped the width of my thumb. I looked upslope where the sandbag line and deadfall diversion were forcing runoff into the old swale Mavis used in 2008, and I laughed once, tired and astonished. It was working. I turned to tell him, and he was already 50 yards off at the cedar edge, standing in rain mist with his head angled toward the herd, bedded on high ground. He looked back once. Not farewell, not demand. Just that same steady regard from the lane, calm as old timber. I lifted my hand in thanks, too spent for more words, and he dipped his head almost imperceptibly before stepping into the trees, each footfall absorbed by wet needles, until the dark took him. Juniper pressed against my knee, soaked and shivering now that the urgency had eased. I crouched and wrapped both arms around her neck, forehead against her wet fur, while rain tapped the brim of my cap, and my breath came ragged with relief. Behind us on the porch, under a dry tarp, Mavis's cedar trunk sat safe where he had set it. I stayed crouched in that lane longer than my knees wanted, arms around Juniper's neck, rain tapping the back of my hands, the cold finally finding me now that the emergency had slackened. She licked once at my wrist and huffed, like she was reminding me I still had a body to run, not just a mind to spin out in. I stood slow, every joint stiff, and turned to look at the porch where the tarp lay smooth over Mavis's trunk. Even in the dark and rain, that shape under canvas hit me square in the chest. I walked up there and knelt beside it, peeling one corner of the tarp back enough to touch cedar. Dry. He had set it high and true, away from runoff, like he understood splash angle and porch pitch better than some contractors I'd hired in my life. My hand stayed on that lid. I could feel my pulse in my fingertips, quick and unsteady. Then all the held-back things I had been carrying since November, and maybe longer than that, came loose at once. I sat down hard on the top step with the rain still coming slantwise through the porch opening, bent over with my elbows on my knees, and cried like a man who had run out of places to store grief. Not loud, not dramatic, just deep, shaking sobs that made my ribs hurt. I cried for Mavis dying while I was 2 days and a lifetime too late. I cried for signing papers in a courthouse and acting like it was paperwork instead of a burial. I cried for how mean and narrow I had gotten inside my own head, like cynicism was a tool and not a cage. Juniper leaned her warm weight against my shin and stayed there without moving. I kept my face in my hands and talked into my palms because there was nobody to impress and nowhere to hide. "I'm sorry, Mavis," I said, voice breaking apart between breaths. "I'm sorry I wasn't here. I'm sorry I kept thinking work would fix what I wouldn't name. I'm sorry I got so hard." The rain answered on the roof in a steady sheet, and creek water muttered in the distance, lower now, still strong. I said the line she used to say when storms came in from the west, and everything on the place had to be moved with calm instead of panic. Grandma said these woods had a guardian. Saying it out loud now felt less like repeating a story and more like admitting a fact I had witnessed with my own eyes and muddy hands. For a long minute, I just breathed and let my body catch up. I told myself this couldn't be real, that exhaustion was writing tall tales on top of bad weather and loss, and the thought fell apart as soon as I looked down at the tarp-covered trunk and the fresh mud prints leading away from it. I was a mechanic. I trusted evidence. Evidence sat 3 feet away from my boots. I wiped my face with my sleeve and gave Juniper a scratch behind her folded ear. "You kept me honest, old girl," I said. "You trusted him first." She sneezed rainwater off her nose and thumped the step once. I laughed through what was left of crying, that rough little laugh that comes when your dignity has already left the premises. "Don't look at me like that. I know I'm a mess. If dogs judged tears, I'd have been fired years ago." By the time I could stand without wobbling, the rain had eased from hard slant to fine drizzle. I checked the herd again with my lamp, counted heads twice, checked the reinforced gate, and walked the sandbag line. It held. Water still moved through the lower swale, but now it moved where we had pushed it to go. In the upper shed, feed sacks stayed dry in a neat wall I had not stacked alone. Each one faced out, labels readable in lantern light. Precision in the middle of chaos. I went back to the porch, pulled the tarp all the way off, and opened Mavis's trunk just enough to inspect the top layer. Recipe tin dry, envelope bundle dry, her old church fan dry. I shut it carefully and covered it again. That small act settled something in me I hadn't realized was trembling for months. Loss was still loss, but not all of it had been taken. 3 days earlier, I would have told you, crying solved nothing. That night, it solved one non-trivial thing. It made room. Grief was still there, but it was no longer welded to shame so tight I couldn't breathe around it. I could feel both without drowning in either. I made coffee on the stove at an hour when decent people were asleep, and emergencies were either over or just beginning. The kitchen smelled like scorched grounds and wet denim. Juniper drank from her bowl, then curled by the wood stove with a grunt that said she had earned her pay. I stood at the sink and watched the backyard through rain-specked glass, half expecting to see movement at the cedar edge, half hoping I wouldn't, because I didn't know what I'd do with another encounter that soon. By the time the eastern ridge shifted from black to charcoal, I pulled on a dry flannel, grabbed my phone, and stepped back onto the porch. Mist rode low over the pasture. The creek noise had dropped 1 full register. Mud shone pewter in early light. On the rail to my right, where there had been nothing when I came in, sat 2 crossed river stones, 1 grey and 1 rust brown, placed with the same measured care as the pair on Mavis's old bird stump. I didn't reach for them right away. I looked out toward the cedars first, scanning the line where shadow met thinning fog. At the far break near the young sycamore, I caught him standing still, half veiled by mist, broad shoulders outlined by first light. He was farther away than last night, giving distance on purpose. No signal for me to come closer. No drama. Just presence. I lifted my hand from the porch rail, palm open in the morning chill. "Thank you," I said again, voice carrying only a little in that wet air. "For all of it." He tipped his head once, a small motion you could miss if you blinked, then turned. He stepped between 2 close cedars without brushing either trunk, paused once, as if checking the pasture one last time, and moved on into the timber. No crashing exit, no look-back theatrics. The woods accepted him the way water accepts a stone set down gently. In another second, there was only mist and tree bark and birds beginning to test their first calls. I stood there until my coffee cooled in my hand. When I finally walked down to the lane, his prints were clear in the fresh mud, deep and even. leading away from the house and angling along the high contour where footing stayed firm. Beside them, near the wood rack, sat a small stack of dry kindling split finer than I ever bothered with, enough for 2 stove starts. Useful, thoughtful, entirely consistent. I took photos with my phone from multiple angles, then laid my tape beside one print and took 2 more for scale. If I was going to carry this memory, I was going to carry it with the same rigor I used at work. I measured heel to toe. I measured stride. I noted time and weather in the Notes app with muddy thumbs. 6:12 a.m., light mist, creek below breach line, prints fresh, kindling dry, stones crossed on porch rail. Not because I planned to convince the world, because I needed my own skeptical brain to have a file it couldn't dismiss on a hard day. At 6:40, I called Dale. He answered sleepy but alert. "You up right?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "Road still rough, but we held. Lost no cattle. Barns standing. Water's dropping." He exhaled long. "Good. Real good. I was fixing to hitch up anyway." I looked toward the cedar break where mist was lifting in strips. "You can come by when the crossing settles. I could use hands resetting lower fence." "I'll bring staples and coffee. Anything else?" I watched Juniper nose the porch step near the crossed stones, then lie down in a patch of weak sun like she trusted the day. "Yeah," I said. "Bring that look you get when you hear something strange and don't laugh too fast." Dale was quiet a beat. "I can do that." After we hung up, I slipped the phone back in my pocket and picked up the 2 stones from the rail. They were cool, smooth, ordinary river rock, one with a white quartz vein that ran corner to corner like a tiny lightning strike. I carried them to Mavis's stump and set them back in, an X, centered the way I had found them, then stood with my hands in my jacket pockets while the first full birdsong of morning spread across the yard. The crux of what had shifted in me was simple and hard to admit. I had built my life around fixing what broke, and I had mistaken that skill for the whole shape of reality. Last night, in flood and mud and exhausted fear, I met a form of care that asked nothing from me except attention and cooperation. It did not erase grief. It stood beside it and made it bearable. Juniper came and leaned into my leg again, lighter now, tail giving that slow, confident thump. I looked once more toward the cedars. Nothing moved there but mist and new light. That was enough. I turned toward the barn, shoulders sore, boots heavy, heart cracked open and steadier than it had been in a long while, and went back to work on a morning that no longer felt empty. By that afternoon, the county gravel crew had pushed enough rock into the low crossing for a pickup to creep over, and Dale came bumping up my drive in his dented green Ford with a thermos wedged on the seat and a coffee can full of fence staples rattling by his boot. Juniper heard him before I did and trotted to the porch with the kind of calm welcome she saved for people she had already cleared in her own mind. I met him at the gate by the lane, and he took one look at my face and didn't ask whether I had slept. He handed me the thermos first. "You look like a man held together by caffeine and weather." "Fair reading," I said. Then I showed him the prints before the sun could soften them any further. We walked the high contour line in near silence, boots sinking and releasing in the same rhythm, and when he reached the first clear impression, he stopped dead, crouched with one hand on his knee and just stared. He set his palm near it, then pulled a tape from his jacket and measured without comment. 52 inches between steps there, 54 at the next stretch where the ground firmed. He stood, looked toward the cedars, then back at me. "You didn't fake this," he said, not as a question. "No." He rubbed rain-stiff whiskers along his jaw. "I knew you didn't. I needed to see it anyway." That was the loaded thing between us, finally spoken plain. We walked back toward the house, and halfway up the lane he slowed and nodded toward Mavis's stump, where the crossed stones sat centered in morning light. She left seed there every day, he said, even in sleet. Said if you fed what was small, something big might remember your name. I waited because he had that look again, the one from the phone when he had nearly said more than he did. I never saw him full, Dale said. Not like you did. Once, 15 years back, I found my east fence mended after an ice storm, wire twisted cleaner than I can do with warm hands. Another spring, 2 calves wandered and turned up bedded dry under pine cover before dawn. No tracks but theirs and bigger ones, out past the brush line. I asked your grandma about it. She just said, kind things don't announce themselves, and poured me more coffee. He let out a breath and gave me a sideways look. I stopped asking after that, figured some truths don't like crowds. We spent the next 3 hours resetting lower fence, replacing 2 bowed posts, and dragging storm trash out of the swale we had diverted in the dark. Work helped. So did shared silence that didn't feel empty. At noon we sat on the porch steps with our backs to the rail and ate bologna sandwiches from wax paper. I set Mavis's cedar trunk between us and opened it fully in daylight for the first careful inventory since the flood. Dale held items while I called them out and dried corners with an old shop towel. Recipe tin, I said. Dry. Photo envelopes rubber-banded. Dry. Little warped on one corner, but fine. Grandad's watch. He turned it over in his palm, wiped the crystal with his sleeve, and set it back. Still not running. Never did run since '89. Then it's consistent. We both smiled at that, and I wrote each item in a spiral notebook, date and condition, then put the notebook in a contractor bag and tucked it under the tray so I wouldn't lose the record. Physical facts accounted for. Memory accounted for too. Before he left, Dale leaned against his tailgate and looked at me over the roof of his truck. You telling anybody else? I shook my head. I kept photos, measurements, notes, backed them up to a flash drive. 1 copy in the safe at the shop in town, 1 here in the desk. I'm not chasing attention. I just refuse to gaslight myself later. He nodded slowly. That's about right. I did call county emergency this morning, I said. Reported culvert damage and crest level. They logged it and said they'll inspect next week. Good. Let paper people handle paper. He paused with his hand on the door frame. Your grandma trusted you with this place for a reason, Roy. Don't confuse pain with disqualification. When he drove out, I stood in the yard until his dust settled, and the place went quiet except for creek water dropping back into its normal channel. I took the 2 porch stones, carried them to the stump, and reset the X because that felt like saying grace in the only language I had. 3 days later, with roads passable and my clothes finally dry all the way through, I sat at Mavis's kitchen table and called my wife. I had rehearsed that call 6 times and hated every draft. When she answered, her voice was cautious but not hard. Roy. Yeah, it's me. I won't keep you long. A pause. All right. I looked out the window at Juniper sleeping in a warm patch by the shed. I'm not calling to reopen anything. Papers are papers. I just needed to say you were right about me going quiet for whole seasons. I treated silence like it was strength. It wasn't. It was me hiding. I'm sorry for what that did to you. I heard her breathe in, then out. Thank you for saying that. I mean it. I know, she said, and her voice softened in a way I hadn't heard in months. How's your grandmother's place? I let that question sit 1 heartbeat, then answered with the truth she could carry. Flood hit hard, we held. I'm fixing fence and roof. I think I'm keeping it. That sounds like you finally choosing something instead of escaping it. Maybe so. Take care of yourself, Roy. You too. We ended there. No dramatic repair, no grand closure speech. Just two people speaking honestly for once and leaving the line clean. It was enough. The following Monday, I drove to the county office where I had planned to file listing paperwork, and instead told the clerk to close the sale prep file under Mavis Ramsey's parcel. She slid the folder back across the counter and asked if I was sure. I signed a withdrawal form with a pen chained to the desk, printed my name clear, and felt something settle in my shoulders, as if a weight had been moved from one shelf to another shelf that could bear it. Outside, I sat in my truck for a minute with the engine off, listening to the tick of cooling metal, and realized I wasn't numb. I was tired, yes, and still sad, but not hollow. By the second week of April, Green had started pushing through every place the flood had scoured. I repaired the west fascia board, replaced the mudroom shingles, and rebuilt the back step square enough that Mavis would have approved my corners. Dale came over on Saturdays with staples, stories, and opinions about my post spacing. Juniper supervised from a dry patch and barked once whenever we argued over measurements, which was often enough to keep us humble. One evening, after we finished setting the last brace, Dale handed me a paper sack from his truck. Inside were morels, still dusty from the woods. "Found these by my North Ridge," he said. I looked at him over the bag. "You sure?" He gave a small shrug. "Call it neighbourly, call it tradition." I cooked them in butter in Mavis's cast-iron skillet and ate at the counter while rain tapped the window, and the smell carried me straight back to being 12 in that same kitchen, muddy and hungry and certain somebody older than me had things handled. On the first clear morning after that rain, I carried a scoop of cracked corn to the stump and scattered it in a wide ring the way Mavis used to do, then set 2 clean stones in an X at the centre. Juniper sat beside me, tail moving slow. The cedar line stood still, sun angled gold through the lower branches, and I felt watched in the gentlest sense of that word, not observed for judgment, but included. I didn't ask for signs. I didn't bargain. I just stood there and said, "Thank you for that night," into the open air, then went to feed the herd. I still trust talk specs and weather reports. I still label bins, keep receipts, and write dates on tape with a black marker so I can find things when life gets messy. But now there is another line in my framework, one Mavis tried to hand me years ago, and I was too proud to accept. Practical truth and mystery are not enemies. A measured track in mud can sit beside gratitude without either one shrinking. A man can carry grief and still be met by kindness he did not earn. If you came out to my place now, you'd see a working homestead, not a monument. Cattle on high pasture, fence true, roof tight, cedar trunk in the front room, dry and cared for, with the notebook inventory in its lid pocket and a flash drive taped beneath the tray in a zip bag, because old habits die usefully. You'd see crossed stones on a stump by the path, sometimes one pair, sometimes 2. You'd see an old cattle dog sleeping easier than she did before that flood night. And if you stood on the porch at first light when mist hangs low in the cedars, you might understand why I no longer talk about this place like I'm trying to leave it. My grandmother said the woods had a guardian. She was never wrong about anything.